On behalf of GLF Colorado, Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, Festival producer Sanjay K. Roy, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, Boulder Public Library, and the City of Boulder, we welcome you to this session of GLF Colorado 2021 Virtual Festival. Writing Kabul, Christina Lamb, Shazia Haya Ahmadzai, Sanaz Fotouhi, and Taran N in conversation with Pragya Tiwari. A session focused on the severity of navigating and depicting Afghanistan's conflicted lands as women. Award-winning foreign correspondent and writer Christina Lamb's Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women provides harrowing first-hand accounts of women's experience in war zones. She is joined by journalists Shazia Haya Ahmadzai and Taran N. Shazia's last piece before escaping Kabul addresses the rights and future of Afghan women. Taran's acclaimed portrait of proscribed spaces, Shadow City, A Women Walks Kabul, is kindred to author and filmmaker Sanaz Fotouhi's latest, Love Marriage in Kabul, a memoir, which details the challenges in making the namesake documentary. In conversation with Pragya Tiwari today, pioneering voices in the discourse surrounding Afghanistan explore the process of covering the region as women. Christina Lamb is chief foreign correspondent at the Sunday Times and one of Britain's leading foreign journalists, as well as best-selling author. She has reported from most of the world's hotspots, starting with Afghanistan after an unexpected wedding invitation, which led her to Karachi in 1987, when she was just 21. She has since been awarded Foreign Correspondent of the Year 5 times and written 9 books, including Farewell Kabul, as well as co-authoring the international bestseller I Am Malala with Malala Yousafzai. Her latest book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, about sexual violence in conflict, was shortlisted for Britain's top nonfiction award, the Baillie Gifford Prize, as well as the Orwell Lit Prize and New York Public Library Bernstein Award. Shazia Haya Ahmadzai is an Afghan journalist who has only just emerged from quarantine following her dramatic escape from Kabul. She pursued her career in journalism against the wishes of her father, uncles, and brothers, saying, I never gave up fighting for my human rights in my own family and in society. She has reported for the BBC's Pashto service and presented an episode of Hard Talk, Open Jirga, from Kandahar in the Taliban's heartland earlier this year. Her last piece of journalism before being forced to flee her country was published in Chatham's House, the World Today magazine. It ends with the words, Afghan women hope that the world will not abandon and forget them again. Unbelievably, it seems that is exactly where we appear to be heading. Sanaz Fotouhi, a Melbourne-based writer, academic, filmmaker, and the former director of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. Her latest book, Love Marriage in Kabul, a memoir, chronicles her journey to Afghanistan as part of a 2-member team to make documentaries about the country. Taran N is the author of Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. She's a journalist and non-fiction writer who writes on gender, culture, and cinema. Pragya Tiwari is a journalist who has written extensively on politics, identity, policy, and culture, and edited publications such as Tehelka, The Big Indian Picture, and Vice. She currently works as a policy and culture consultant. She is the creative director of Oijo Media and co-founder of the Indian History Collective. Do follow our social media handles to get notified on the upcoming sessions. We have struggled to bring you GLF Colorado without charging a registration fee. Please support as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. You can support us through the Support GLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your support is greatly appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, Walking Kabul, Christina Lamb, Shazia Haya Ahmadzai, Sanaz Fotouhi, and Taran N in conversation with Pragya Tiwari. Pragya, over to you.
Thank you very much. And there is much to talk about. I am absolutely delighted to be in conversation with the 4 incredible women on this panel. So I'm going to get right to it. And I'm going to start with you, Shazia. with a very sort of immediate question. Like Anubhav mentioned in the introduction, you have just about very recently emerged from quarantine after what might be described as a rather dramatic escape from Afghanistan. And like you said before, you did leave the country. You were a journalist, and you became a journalist, much against the wishes of at least some people in your family, and you were doing rather fantastic and courageous work from Afghanistan. Could you tell us a little bit about the escape? Could you tell us a little bit about the decision to leave? Because I cannot imagine that being an easy decision for anybody, and what it takes for not just for someone like you, but for other men and women who are stuck in similar situations. What does escape mean for them? Are there really routes to escape? Is there hope to get away?
Yeah, thank you so much. And first of all, please forgive me because of my voice. I got flu just because of the weather of London, rainy weather. Well, when I was in Kabul, I never imagined that one day I would have to escape from my homeland, from my family, and behind my I would have to leave behind my country, my family, my hopes and dreams. It's like just everything was taken from you, and you cannot do anything about that. You know what? I had an identity in my country, a middle class life, a job which I loved the most. I had a plan for my further education. I want to get a master's degree in my country just in this year. And I had some plans even for my personal life, but just one day a sudden storm came and everything was taken from us, and we cannot do anything about that. You know, I left my country because as a woman I wouldn't survive there. Now in Afghanistan, an educated, independent woman is not welcome there, is not safe there, because insurgents cannot tolerate a woman who can raise a voice for human rights, for the rights of women, and they cannot tolerate those kind of voices. Because of that, I was the lucky one that somehow I escaped and now I am safe. But I left behind my family. I'm alone here. I have nothing here, and it's really heartbroken. When you had an identity in your homeland, when you're something, when you're someone in your country, when you have a family with yourself, but suddenly something happened and everything was taken from you. It's really disappointing. It's really heartbroken. I even cannot explain that how I feel now. Look, now I'm just a Shazia, but in my country I was a journalist. I was someone. A few people there knew me, but here in England I'm not an educated person, because even now, even I don't know the language of these people. I don't have the education that these people have it. I'm nothing here. It's really difficult for us. Just we came here for surviving, because we couldn't survive in our country. It's really difficult when you see that insurgents surrounded you, the building where you live, and you cannot do anything, and you just hide yourself in kitchen. For several days, I hid myself in a kitchen because there were gunfires, and because of that, maybe it would be dangerous for ourselves. So for the safety of ourselves, me and my mother and my sister, we were in kitchen, and we spent our nights in kitchen. So look, and for the first time when I saw insurgents on the streets in front of the building where I live there, the owner of the building came to me and said that hide your old documents, hide your cards, hide those documents that you have from your office, and we told the insurgents that there's no any journalist, so please, and don't come out, and if you want to come out, so please wear yourself, hide your face. Look, so that was the life of my of myself in there. Because of that, I escaped from my country. I don't say that I left my country. No, I escaped. I escaped from insurgents. I escaped from those people that they cannot tolerate me. They cannot. They don't have the dare of listening my voice as a woman. On 21st of August, in the middle night, I received call from from England, and they said that I should leave my place. So around it was around 11:30 at night. So I wear burqa, I cover my face, and I said goodbye to my mom, which was very difficult for myself. I took taxi and I went to airport. I'm so sorry that a little bit I'm emotional. So when I reached the airport, there were insurgents. They stopped me and said that, where are you going? I couldn't show my documents because of the security reasons. I couldn't tell them that I'm a journalist. So I said that there's my husband in the airport, so please let me in. And they cursed me. They said that, go home. If you don't want to go home, then we will beat you. And then I took roadsides, and by the help of some local drivers, somehow I walked for 2 hours, and then I reached the Baron Hotel. It's the hotel near to airport. I stuck there for almost 5 hours, and you know what? After 4 or 3 years, an explosion took place exactly on that place. So I could have been one of those who lost their lives, but it's by the help of God now I am safe. Still, I'm shocked. Still, I don't have the words to describe that. What happened? Why happened? And why happened to us? Look, just as a normal Afghan girl, I wanted to live in my country. I had dreams there. I had plans for myself, for my mother, for my sister even. I fought for my human rights. Somehow I survived there. I made a life. I tried to survive there, but insurgents came and Kabul fell, and now we are here, and we cannot do anything about that. And let me assure you that right now all Afghan women, Afghan girls, is experiencing more miserable life in Afghanistan, and the world is silent, and it's really disappointed that now the world is silent and say nothing about Afghanistan, especially about Afghan women.
I will come to that in a bit. I have no words. Thank you for your story, but for what it's worth, Shazia, you will never be, you will never not be someone. You will never be a nobody anywhere in the world. But I will come back to you with a follow-up question. I wanted to go to Christina next. Christina, you, I feel rather ironically, wrote a book called Farewell Kabul, but you can't seem to bid goodbye to the country. I mean, the country keeps coming back into your life in one way or another. And you've just returned from Kabul after having spent the last 3 weeks there. Of course, in August onwards, Afghanistan was all over our airwaves, but as it happens, as the nature of news cycles, it started to recede from our airwaves. But life goes on being what it is there. So could you tell us what you saw in the last couple of weeks and what you made of it?
Thank you, and great to be on a panel with so many fabulous women that I really admire. So thank you for that. And goodness, listening to Shazia, I mean, it's heartbreaking, and it was heartbreaking going to Kabul. I've been going there 33 years. It's a city that I absolutely adore. I probably spent more time in Afghanistan than anywhere outside my own country. And to go there this time, I arrived about 2 weeks after the Taliban had taken over, just after the foreign troops had all left, so early September. And to go there and just see this situation, Taliban everywhere, just, you know, many of them never been to Kabul, so all these sort of wide-eyed Taliban wandering around. You've probably seen pictures of them like at the zoo going on dodgems, driving around on Humvees that they have captured from the Americans. Very few women anywhere. Lots of the cafes that used to be full of young people like Shazia with dreams for their future just closed. One of the managers of a coffee shop, he said to me, it feels like a TV screen that has suddenly gone blank. And it really felt like that. It felt like all the life had been sucked out of the city. I was there for 3 weeks, and during that time, life sort of started coming back a bit, but it wasn't normal life. I mean, it was busy. There was traffic. Kabul looked more like it used to look. In fact, the Taliban seemed to have made traffic worse, if that was possible. And the one thing you have to say was it felt much safer. So you didn't go out thinking, I wonder if there's going to be a suicide bomb and when I come back, it felt much safer than it had done before, because the people running the place were the people causing the bombs. My own hotel, when you arrive there, your car is checked by Taliban now, and yet that hotel had been attacked twice in the last 10 years by Taliban. So it all feels very surreal that at the hotel buffet there are Taliban with guns on their backs, and these are the people who had been attacking. And in fact, I went to a remote village in Logar, the neighboring province to Kabul, which was kind of a stronghold of Taliban where I went. And I had a Taliban escort, and I asked him, if I'd come here 6 weeks ago, what would you have done? And he said, well, I would have kidnapped you and killed you. And it was completely matter of fact. And I think we have to remember that for all the Taliban trying to say, we are different, this is new Taliban, actually their actions are not suggesting that. Everything that they have done, whether it's the announcement of the government, which is basically sort of 33 mullahs, almost all Pashtuns, no women, whether it's the re-establishment of the morality police, the Ministry for Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, whether it's the fact that, you see boys going off to school, but you only see very young girls going to school. Afghanistan's now the only country in the world where girls cannot go to secondary school. So this doesn't suggest that things have changed. And it felt so odd going to a place where almost all my friends were either in hiding or had, like Shazia, fled the country. And every day I was getting desperate messages from friends who were still there, pleading for help to get out. Every time I left the hotel, people were grabbing me outside saying, can you get us out of the country? And whatever else happens, Afghanistan is a country that is extremely poor and highly dependent on foreign aid. And at the moment, the Taliban don't have any money to, whether it's to pay wages, to pay for the electricity or anything. And so there are lots of really desperate people. And you see people on the street selling just their very few humble possessions, kettles, plates, mattresses, because they have no way to buy food. So, it's not just the sort of, it's complete shock. I think you got that from Shazia of what's happened, there. I can't think of anything I've ever covered anywhere where something has changed so dramatically, so terribly, so quickly. But also, you know, the desperation of what's going to happen to people, not just in terms of security, but also just to be able to survive.
Christina, you know, that's a really heartbreaking portrait of what's going on the ground level. I mean, there's economic despair. There is still an ongoing pandemic, of course, and then there's the takeover by Taliban with all its sort of ironies that you kind of touched upon. Give us a sense of what is it like? I mean, is it in any way easy to escape Afghanistan at this point in time, and where do people go? I mean, of course, the largest border is with Pakistan, but we know during COVID that was restricted. It's still to a large degree restricted. What is it like for people who want to flee the country? Even the images that we saw in the first couple of days were all mostly of men trying to escape Afghanistan and Kabul. But what about the women? Can they escape? Where would they go? What is that on-ground situation like? And if there's no hope for escape, you mentioned in passing that some of your friends are in hiding. Could you tell us a little bit about what hiding looks like or means for people who are trying to save their lives?
Well, I mean, a lot of women in particular in safe houses, but are moving every 2 or 3 days because they fear that they're going to be tracked down. They, you know, absolutely terrified. And we're talking everybody from, I went to see female judges, female police, a theatre director, someone that ran a shelter, and also air hostesses, because they can't work. So you had this group of 10 air hostesses in a room together in hiding. You know, it's impossible to understate just how everyone's dreams have been literally snatched overnight. And, you know, some people said to me, would have been better if the West had never got involved in Afghanistan at the last, because you sort of felt, what was the point now of the last 20 years? And some people said, you know, it'd have been better if you'd never come, because we got dreams that have now been destroyed overnight. I mean, I still think that it was better that there were lots of people who have had higher education, and, you know, we can talk about all the mistakes that were made and why. But in terms of people being able to get out now, it's very difficult because the flights stopped when the last foreign troops left. Qatari Airways are the only people that are flying people out, but you have to have a foreign passport and you have to be approved by your foreign embassy. So many days those huge planes were flying out with only 10, 12 people on, and often they were mostly foreign journalists basically hitching a lift. And the system just doesn't seem to work. I mean, the British, for example, Boris Johnson promised 20,000 vulnerable Afghans would be helped. As far as I can make out, nobody has come out on that scheme, because if you even go on the website, you can't get onto it. It says nothing's happening yet. If you send them an email, you get back a message saying that this email address no longer works. So, you know, people have been left a bit without hope. It's okay if they work for an organization like the World Bank. I mean, even the BBC, they got out a lot of people, but a lot of people are still there who were working with them. But people who are not attached to a major organization, now it's extremely difficult, because there just isn't the way to get out. There aren't flights, there aren't commercial flights. Pakistan has closed its border. Weirdly, so a few people are managing to get Pakistan visas, but then you have to pay $1,500 to get on a charter flight to Pakistan. I mean, that's really difficult for people. Iran has helped a few people get out, Uzbekistan, but it's really just a few. It's very complicated. And if you talk to the British or Americans, because they've promised a lot of people who are still there that they would get them out, they say that the problem is the Taliban is not agreeing to allow people out, and so there's nothing they can do, basically. So yeah, I mean, it's a really miserable situation. And I mean, personally know a lot of people still stuck, and you just feel powerless because, you know, I've endlessly contacted the Foreign Office in the UK, various other embassies and things, but it's not really achieving anything at the moment.
Taran, I wanted you to come in at this point in time. You know, it's interesting that Christina mentioned that, you know, maybe perhaps out of despair or perhaps out of sheer frustration, she's heard voices saying that it would have been best if the West hadn't intervened at all. I mean, what came of this? When you researched and wrote your book, it was this sort of time of a tentative normalcy, though obviously that is a very, very difficult word to you know, sort of use in the context of Afghanistan, but there was a kind of flux between war and peace when you were reporting your book. And, you know, you took a very interesting route to telling the story of Kabul, which was essentially, you know, walking the street and sort of, which is obviously a gendered experience, not unlike what it is like for women in India, but obviously you're in this relatively foreign city to you. And through those walks, through those journeys, you tried to tap into stories and narratives and lives of people beyond the pale of the persistent narrative of war. Could you tell us a little bit about what you discovered about Kabul and its identity and Kabulis and their identities with respect to war and outside the context of it?
Thanks, Pragya. I do want to take a moment, like Christina, to say how much I appreciate being on a panel with women talking about the city. And thank you, Shazia, for sharing your story, which is obviously so important for everyone to hear right now. And I'm really grateful that I got to hear it from you. I think, Pragya, like you rightly say, normalcy is such a relative term to use for Kabul. In fact, it's very poignant to even read back portions of my book or to remember the days when I was in Kabul, because it seems very tempting to talk about it with this sort of nostalgia or this romantic hindsight. But it was a very difficult time, of course. It was a time where there was everyday violence of the kind that Christina mentioned. I think it would be a mistake to romanticize what Afghans have lived through the past 20 odd years as well. And I think that makes it all the more tragic of the situation we're in now. So I feel, like I mentioned in my book, that what I found in this city was layers of forgetting. And it took me a long time to probe, to be able to go beyond that, to be able to experience the city as a place with history, with a place of history beyond that of the past, at that time, 40 years of war. And I think listening to Shazia now, listening to Christina now, I think it's very imminent, another kind of erasure, which of course isn't, it isn't a sort of unexpected or you know, it's not an innocent erasure. It's quite, there is a system behind it, there's a design behind it, there's a reason why we only hear about places like Kabul at a time of crisis, which is of course why we only think of Kabul as a place of crisis. Whereas for the last so many years, journalists have been, and people have been trying to draw attention to what's going on in the country. And that's been met with, you know, a lot of disinterest. And again, this isn't the first time this has happened to the city. And of course, I'm only talking about the city, which is a place I know in Kabul in many ways is an anomaly, as we know it was the city where so many of the benefits of the foreign intervention were felt. It was where you could see so many people's lives change in so many ways. And yet it was also a city that was marked by everyday violence. And I think it's just really important to remember that there have been these phases of violence before that were conveniently forgotten. And I fear, I mean, what I fear is there is a lot of the oxygen around the media reportage and even the coverage that came out during the time of crisis was about evacuations and about people being, you know, saved. And as Christina said, it's so difficult for everyone to leave. And at the end, there will be so many people who will have to make their lives under this really difficult regime. And I think what I would worry about, or what I feel very strongly coming up, is the erasure of these voices as well, the fact that they will cease to be important. And this links to what Shazia mentioned about how she feels about having left Afghanistan. And this is a story of so many refugees, because this is Afghans have been refugees now since the 70s. There are generations of people who have been forced to leave their country, who have faced dislocation. And I happen to write about a few people who I'd known in Kabul as creative people, as filmmakers, as journalists, as doing interesting work, doing valuable work, smart, creative people with so much to offer. And they had to take the really difficult decision to leave. And in the reckoning, I suppose, of the countries where they had gone to, like Europe or the US, they were the lucky ones. But they also faced this very subtle form of erasure, where the only stories they could legitimately tell was that of being refugees or that of escaping. And it was as if their entire lives before had been wiped out. And if they tried to sort of speak in that holistic sense, they just met this wall of indifference. So I think what we're looking at now, and which kind of links to what I experienced in Kabul, was how many ways there are to forget the city, and how if you sort of go beyond, if you interrogate that forgetting, how it links to the reasons why it is facing this kind of crisis once again.
Sanaz, if you ended up telling a story which was, again, like Taran's story, not what one would expect in terms of the kind of straightforward narratives that come out of Afghanistan, particularly in the last 20 odd years. You made a film, a documentary film, and then you wrote about what it was like to make films being a woman in Afghanistan, and through particular stories and lenses examining the lives of other women and widows and orphans. Could you take us through what that experience was like for you and what it took out of you to try and tell those stories through your films?
Well, first, thank you for this amazing panel, and such an honor to be here talking to such group of amazing women who are doing such great work. So to tell you a little bit about the background of of what I did, I went into Afghanistan, and I was part of a 2-member documentary team. It was just me and my partner Dan, and we went in and we made 2 films about Afghanistan. So the first film that we made was about women's self-burning as a form of suicide after the Taliban had fallen. So the first time that we went to Afghanistan was 2006. And we wanted to investigate why it was that women were burning themselves as a form of suicide, and why there was an increase in the number of women suicide. So we made that film, and coming back from that, what we felt was that we hadn't really done justice, because when we got to Australia, people didn't want to know about what was going on there, because the topic was so raw, it was so deep, and it was so confronting that when we started telling people, when we showed the film, people were like, oh, I don't want to see it, I don't want to deal with it because it's so raw and confronting. So we felt, I particularly felt, that there was elements that we hadn't done justice, because we needed to tell the story, or a story that could touch people's heart, as opposed to people kind of like, not wanting to know. So for several years, we looked for another film topic, and we eventually ended up going back to Kabul with a woman, Mahbooba Ravi, who runs an orphanage from Australia. And through her, we made a documentary about these 2 kids in her orphanage who are trying to get married. So we follow the journey of a young man and a young woman as they're trying to get married. So when the films came out, this film, when it came out, it was extremely successful in Australia, and it was, showed on the major festivals, really great international appeal, because it was telling a story that was really heart-opening, the story of a love, and people could see the struggle of people in Afghanistan, and also all the war and everything that was going on behind. But what happened is when the film came out, when both of these films came out, I felt like there's a lot that has been not said that I had seen and experienced as a young woman going into Afghanistan that needed to be heard, because there were stories of women and children and orphans and of others who were not told in these movies. Not to mention also what I experienced as a woman going in. I was in my early 20s when I first went into Afghanistan, and it was really confronting. So I started out writing about this process and the journey and that I went through, and at the same time expanding on a lot of the voices of the women, children, and narratives that didn't get to be shared in the films. And I think there was just going back a little bit, the benefit of me being there to making these films and to also understanding what's going on under the skin of the city was that being a woman was actually a privilege, because my partner, he, being a man, he wouldn't have had access to a lot of the things that we were given access because of my presence. So for example, when we went into the women's burn unit in the hospitals, there was no way he would have been able to go in and do the interviews and understand what's really going on. And similarly, in the orphanage, when we went with Mahbouba's Promise, Mahbouba Ravi's organization, it was the presence of me as a woman, which gave us access to a different layer of the society, a different layer of what was going on. It took a lot out of me, personally, going in, and I'm sure all the women here who've been to Afghanistan, it takes something to go in and experience that and then come out and then somewhat having to live a normal life. And then knowing that, yes, you can help, you can contribute, but there's only so much you can contribute, because what we're going through, what Afghanistan is going through, is so much bigger and us individuals and all of us even combined. It's massive. So there was a period of absolute hopelessness in my part, not knowing what I can do. And I think that was the biggest catalyst for me to write the book, because the film did what it did, and I felt that there was another layer that I could dig deeper in and express what was really happening. To give another layer, to give another angle to the story. So yeah, it was really amazing and really eye-opening, and like the lives of all of you who've been to Kabul here, life will never be the same once you've experienced Afghanistan.
Very quick follow-up question, Sanaz. You write your book, you go into Afghanistan for the first time when Taliban is falling. This is a couple of years after the US intervention there starts. And, it is still, of course, the people must have been happy to see the back of Taliban, but at the same time, despair is not quite over and done with. You chronicle that with your films, you chronicle that in your book. And ironically, just right after your book comes out, or just a short while after your book comes out, we find ourselves in this moment in history that seems to be a loop back to when things were even worse. How do you find yourself thinking back about Afghanistan and some of the subjects that you have dealt with, and who I'm sure would have come close to you in one way or the other through your storytelling efforts? In this moment in time, what do you think? How do you think this will impact them?
It's just beyond words for me, because I know that like Mahbouba's Promise orphanages and schools and all her work, she has been working there for over 30 years. It's all was dismantled. It's all been dismantled, and all the kids, all the girls, all the boys, they've had to be sent back to their villages, to wherever they came from, and a lot of them don't even have anywhere to go. So yeah, incredible impact. And the irony of it is, the first time that we went to Afghanistan, women and young women were like, they're always looking over their shoulder. They're always afraid that the Taliban will come back. So, you know, it's just, I think, one of the biggest nightmares.
Taran, I wanted to ask you another sort of follow-up question from what you'd spoken about. When I was growing up, you know, war-torn regions, the stories of war-torn regions were always told by men, and mostly white men, and that I grew up reading Hemingway, and you know, I didn't know better, so obviously I loved those books, and until the point when I realized that, you know, I was sick of listening to white men tell me about what's happening in foreign countries. And therefore, you know, writers like Christina mean so much to journalists like myself. I mean, we practically worship the handful of women correspondents and the work that they have done, war correspondents and the work that they have done. I want to hear your thoughts on the politics of, you know, who's telling the story, who gets to tell the story, and your own sort of perhaps conundrums as you made your way through this narrative and the telling of this narrative as a woman, as a foreigner, but not quite. What were the kinds of choices you found yourself confronting?
That's a really thoughtful question, Pragya. Thanks. Yeah, I did deal with a lot of this stuff while I was both in Kabul and also while writing about Kabul. And I think it came down to this, that I would Kabul seems to be a place which is written about so much. And there's this whole history of writing about Kabul. As you say, it's a history of mostly men, mostly white men, or men from traditional centers of power describing this place to us, which is really also, if you think about it, how we see the world is it being described by people from the traditional centers of power. And when I began writing about Kabul, I did collide with this idea of what is it that I was trying to offer that could be that could add to the way the city was seen. And I wrote the book because I felt quite strongly that the way of writing about Kabul was very limiting. It felt very limited to me when I would write news stories or features. It felt like I was leaving out all the really interesting, beautiful stuff about the city, which, I mean, the history of poetry, the fabulous myths and stories and fables I heard from people who I shared my days and evenings with. You know, the whole connection to India, the part of the feeling of being part of a larger cultural arc, of being part of a larger cultural world, that I got very strongly in Kabul. And of course, also the ways in which violence and war had embedded itself in lives of people in ways that weren't always apparent. The idea that war wasn't only something you could encounter at a front line. It was actually something that people lived with every day. You know, a photograph of a father who had been missing for 30 years is like a monument. It's clearer than, and especially if that father doesn't have a grave, you don't know where he is, which was the case for a friend of mine. He only had this photograph as a memorial to his dad. Things like this were what I felt were really important to communicate about Kabul. How was I to write about it was a difficult question as an Indian woman. Writing about a space so deeply inscribed by Western writers. And I think for me, the penny really dropped was when I really sat down and I asked myself, well, who is it that you would trust to describe the space if you don't really truly trust your own self or your own ways of telling these stories, or the stories that you feel interesting and should be told? Then who is it that you trust? And of course, it was the figure of the authority figure that you and I both had grown up listening to and hearing the world described by these figures. And I think for me, the moment when I realized that my own history and my own heritage or my own way of relating to Kabul was leading me to stories that were so interesting, that were stories of interiors maybe, that were stories that I heard in the evenings from the people I lived with, from the people I worked with, men and women both. But they showed me the city in a completely different way, of a city of a great amount of a cosmopolitan way of life, a city with a lot of complexity. Nothing was really simple. The narratives that we had learned to trust of people being saved, people being not being able to change their own lives, of having no agency, they just fell away. So I think for me, the moment when I realized that no, actually this was an asset, who I am and the stories I'm seeing are very interesting and they definitely deserve to be told. think that was for me the moment when the book really fell into place. And I think I talk about this not because it's my story, like a big part of the book, writing the book, was that I didn't want it to be memoir. I didn't want it to be the revelation of a journalist going into a war zone. But it's so deeply political, it's so important, the idea that narratives about places like Kabul can come from places which are not traditional centers of power, that can come from voices that are not so dominant in this discourse. I think that's why I feel it's important to speak about this. And of course, later you can talk about the book as war reportage or as travel or as partly memoir. But when I was writing it, to me, it was reportage. But this is a different way of reportage, I think, which is too often discounted when we talk about telling stories of war. And I think there is a huge need for diversity and just many, many voices telling these stories about these spaces.
Well, I'm certainly grateful you wrote that book. It's just an astoundingly wonderful book. Christina, coming to you, and before we close with Shazia, 20 years, trillions of dollars, and a large question mark. What happened exactly? Do you think that the way things have ended up was inevitable? Or do you think that things could have turned out differently? And if yes, what might have been done differently for even a slightly more hopeful present than the one that we are confronted with?
I mean, this really is the $1 trillion question. I think people are going to be writing books and theses, postgraduate theses on this for years. I mean, first of all, this is the biggest humiliation to Western forces in modern times, and what does that mean? But more importantly, at the moment, what does it mean for people in Afghanistan? Why did it happen? I mean, when Kabul fell, and I have to admit, I was in the middle of the Amazon, so I can't say I was somebody that predicted this was going to happen. I mean, it seemed to happen all so quickly. It was within 10 days that the Taliban captured all the major cities of Afghanistan. Why? I mean, obviously the Afghan army just folded. They didn't stand up. You didn't see lots of photographs of dead bodies in the streets as a result of the Taliban takeover, because there wasn't that much fighting. And as we know, the president and the government jumped into helicopters and fled. But why did that happen? Why did this expensively built 300,000 supposedly Afghan security forces, why didn't they fight? I think, this is the result of 20 years of mistakes. It's not something that happened as a result of the last few weeks or months. And I mean, it would take a very long time to catalogue all of that. But, the catalyst obviously was the way that the Americans left, that it was done so precipitously that the Afghan security forces were not really given the help they were used to having. The American air power, the intelligence, the logistics support, all of that was taken away almost overnight. And so, the idea that they would stand up and fight without any of that was quite difficult. But the main reason was nothing to do with that. I think it was more to do with all of the things that had gone before. Why were those security forces, why did they not have the morale to stand up? Because they were fighting for a government that a lot of people in Afghanistan saw as the biggest problem in their lives, that was corrupt, that wasn't delivering to people. And then you'd had years of Western forces making lots of mistakes and not respecting the culture, going into people's houses in the middle of night and night raids, going into women's quarters, killing civilians. I mean, the previous time I'd been in Afghanistan was 2 years ago. And at that time, I remember going to the emergency hospital in Kabul, which treats for free victims of war. And there were equally as many people there who were victims of the coalition forces, the NATO forces and Afghan forces, as there were victims of Taliban. So people, ordinary innocent people, were being caught between both sides. And so, many people thought that the biggest problem was the NATO forces. Going right back to the very beginning, when the Taliban fell in 2001, and overnight all these sort of Western advisors poured in that were mostly highly paid. Rather than training people there to do the jobs, they were often coming and just being paid themselves to do it when they didn't understand the culture. There wasn't a discussion with people about, it seemed to me, what they really wanted. There was this imposing from outside, what's the most important thing for Afghanistan? Oh, they need elections, Western style elections. Nobody I spoke to in Afghanistan at the time said to me, what we really need is a Western style election. So, there are countless things that you can look at, mistakes that were made over the years, and failure to listen to people on the ground, which, I'm afraid is not just in Afghanistan. We've seen the same thing in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. It's very frustrating, actually, as a journalist reporting this, because we feel like we report these things and then the same mistakes are made over and over again. And then, people just lose interest. Look at the situation in Libya, in Syria. Now people are more or less accepting Assad now because they don't know what else to do. So it's very frustrating, and I will assure Shazia that there are a lot of Western correspondents, particularly women, who are passionate about Afghanistan, and will continue to keep going and reporting there and fighting our editors to be able to report. So I don't think that if it's anything to do with us, we're not going to let this be forgotten, and the situation of women in particular, because you cannot make all the promises that were made by the West and then just pretend that nothing's happened and move on to the next thing. You really cannot do that. Otherwise, their word stands for nothing.
That gives me so much hope, Christina. Thank you for that. And Shazia, finally, I wanted to, the last piece that you wrote before you left Afghanistan, before you were forced to leave Afghanistan, rather, you ended with a plea to the world to not ignore the plight and fate of women in Afghanistan. And I can't even imagine what it feels like for you, because in the aftermath of Kabul falling, even a woman like myself sitting very, very far away in New Delhi, as I saw governments trying to make sort of tentative peace, if you will, with the new Taliban government and start negotiations with them, there was so much of sort of latent anger that one felt in terms of how the fate of women was factored into all of this. And as usual, one ends up seeing the specter of men negotiating with men without the voices of women being factored in. Today, if you had to ask the world community to factor in the voices of women, what would your appeal be to them? What do you think can and must be done?
Well, the world has left a country where still women have no identities. In 21st century, girls are not allowed to go to schools. In 21st century, educated women are not allowed to go to jobs, and they are the breadwinners of their families. The world has abandoned a country where field courts now take place. If there's no law in a country, if there's no justice in a country, if the citizens of a country, including women, are not allowed to get educations or go to school or go to jobs, if there's a poverty in a country, if there's no freedom of expression in a country, so I want to ask the world that, do you think that the world will be a better and place safe? And the world should think about this. It's it's a very simple question that I want to ask the world. That do you think, are you now safe? And as an Afghan girl, I know that was the question from the Afghan women, because I am also Afghan woman, including other Afghan women that are experiencing miserable life there in Afghanistan, and me. We all are asking the world that what's saying of why Afghan women should always be the victims, why we should always sacrifice, why we should always be abandoned, why we should be imprisoned in homes, why we should not have identities like other women in other countries have. We just want simple thing, a safe life, education, and have a right for doing job. It's very basic and simple rights that we want from world, and unfortunately we don't have it. And I don't know why that in 21st century women in Afghanistan are not allowed to go to schools, to go to universities, to go to jobs. And I don't know why that the world is still silent. I just request the world that please raise voices for Afghanistan. Please don't abandon Afghanistan. There's a lives, there's a hopes, and there are human beings that live, and their life should be matter. And it's a simple request from the world that please don't forget, at least don't forget Afghan girls and women who are now imprisoned in homes, who cannot go to schools or jobs. Please don't forget Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Shazia. Thank you for your stories and your perspectives, Shazia, Taran, Christina, and Sanaz. And thank you, Jaipur Literature Festival, as usual, for platforming our voices. I can only pray that people are listening, and I can only pray for Afghanistan. Thanks once again for listening to us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, Shazia, Sanaz, Taran, and Pragya for presenting the stories of many. It was truly a heart-wrenching session. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available at Boulder Bookstore within the USA. If you like the session, do consider supporting us through the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your support is greatly appreciated. Once again, we would like to thank all our official partners for generously supporting us. We hope you all enjoyed these sessions and will tune in for our next session. This red line goes straight to your heart. Madhur Anand in conversation with Mala Srilal, introduced by Sylvain Fabi, Consul General of Canada in Denver, at 2 p.m. Mountain Time, 1:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time, 3 p.m. Central Time, 1 p.m. Pacific Time, and 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you once again. And now presenting a reading from the JLF Writer Short Series, The Return of a King by William Dalrymple.
Hello, my name is William Dalrymple. I am one of the directors of the Jaipur Literature Festival, but I'm here now as the writer. I'm going to read to you from Return of a King, my book about the first Western intervention in Afghanistan. And I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs from the opening section. The book has come back into the bestseller lists again recently because it tells of the failure of the first Western intervention in Afghanistan at a time when we're all thinking about the current failure of the West and how the Taliban have come back into power so tragically. This is the first chapter, No Easy Place to Rule. The year 1809 opened auspiciously for Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk. It was now March, the very beginning of that brief Afghan spring, and the pulse was slowly returning to the veins of the icy landscape, long clotted with drifts of waist-high snow. Now the small, sweet-smelling Istalif irises were pushing their way through the frozen ground. The frozen rime on the trunks of the deodars was running to snowmelt, and the Ghilzai nomads were unlatching their fat-tailed sheep from the winter pens, breaking down their goat-hair tents and readying their flocks for the first of the spring migrations to the new grass of the high pastures. It was just then, at that moment of thaw of sap, that Shah Shuja received a piece of good news, something of a rarity in his troubled reign. It concerned the recovery of some lost family property. The largest diamond of the world, the Koh-i-Noor, or Mountain of Light, had been missing for more than a decade, but such was the turbulence of the times that no attempt had been made to find it. Shah Zaman, Shuja's elder brother and predecessor on the throne of Afghanistan, was said to have hidden the gem shortly before being captured and blinded by his enemies. A huge Indian ruby known as the Fakraj, the family's other most precious gem, had also disappeared at the same time. Shah Shuja summoned his blind brother and questioned him on the whereabouts of their father's most famous jewels. Was it really true that he knew where they were hidden? Shah Zaman revealed 9 years earlier he had hidden the Fakraj under a rock in a stream near the Khyber Pass, shortly before being taken prisoner. Later he had slipped the Koh-i-Noor into a crack in the wall of the fortress shell where he was first seized and bound. A court historian later recorded, Shah Shuja immediately dispatched a few of his most trustworthy men to find the two gems and advised them that they should leave no stone unturned in their efforts. They found the Koh-i-Noor with a Shinwari sheikh who in his ignorance was using it as a paperweight for his official papers. As for the Fakraj, they found it with a Talib, a student, who had uncovered it when he went to a stream to wash his clothes. They impounded both gems and brought them both back into the king's service.
Festival like this is a beautiful indication of the kind of thing that I truly, truly believe in, and I think makes our society more whole and more pure.
We do not take it for granted that Boulder was chosen as the first North American satellite festival. It's a huge honor we will not forget, and we are enriched because of it. We are indebted to both the local and international people that came together to make that happen, and we hope it's a tradition that continues for decades to come.
Literary festivals like this one build up an environment and an ecosystem to nurture readers and to promote the business of books. They provide an invaluable forum for writers to connect with other creative people.
We sit there peering into those electronic grids in front of our eyes, and it only increases the desire to see the real thing in the flesh. To actually hear an author speak firsthand, to read from their work, to hear the tones of their voice modulate as they read their most treasured passages of prose.
For us, it's special. This was our mothership, and it continues to be. The other editions that we have across the United States are smaller versions, different programming, but smaller versions.
In a sense, to me, religion and art are the same thing. They're vaguely irrational, but they help make sense of things. Someone who lives with no arts and no religion has very little to live on.
2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom.
You have to think of viruses as intelligent machines, as code crackers. And like all living forms, they have to adapt to their environment.
Imagination is a powerful tool. It doesn't matter which part of the world we are in our situation. Are we behind locked bars? Are we roaming freely? Independent thought and process. Our imagination allows us to soar out of any present circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that really is the power of literature and the written word. It allows us to envision a better future. It allows us to consider our past and make sense of the present. Imagination is a tool to be able to free us from the binds and the constrictions that we find ourselves locked into. We can break free. We can soar through the universe. We can rise up into the darkened night like a firefly, illuminating the world. This is what JLF Boulder, Colorado hopes to bring you, something to fire your imagination.